Celebrating the legacy of freedom through stronger links between people and parliament. That's the theme. But why is that an important theme? Has there been a major disconnect between the people and the elected representatives?
Well, in fact, if you remember him very well, just before his trial was completed, he was there with the people. Even as he was campaigning during the elections, you could see that this is a people's man. So I think he's brought a lot himself. And through him coming in, we've seen a lot of cooperation, a lot of parliament being closer to the people in terms of really focusing on the issues of the day.
What are the issues of the day? I mean, this year's speech, the focus has been on economic upliftment and specifically job creation.
Well, if you remember in the election, his goal was exactly that he wants to create jobs. And not only creating jobs, but also making sure that the poor have got access to education, healthcare, as well as just mentioned a bit about national health insurance. So it's all a package of being seen to be a delivery man, because in the past 16 years, we've had a lot of speech, but very few signs of saying that the ANC has implemented all its good policies that are on the table.
I mean, we talk about the state of the nation being an opportunity to evaluate successes and failures, and many would say, as was said earlier on, the policies on paper sound fantastic. The problem is in the implementation. And when you look at the rise of agitation and the number of service delivery protests that have mounted, there's something that's not quite adding up just by way of delivery to the people.
Well, we know very clearly, 16 years later, that perhaps the way we applied our transformation policies by getting rid of some of the bureaucrats that were there, that came from many years of implementing public policy, by bringing blacks who are fresh and mass, we might have thrown the baby with the bathwater. So there's a real appreciation that perhaps the deployment policies that focus on cadreship may not necessarily be with us going forward. We need to bring back people that have got skills, that people can be aligned to the promo government, and really implement programs for the electorate to benefit.
The state of the economy right now, we know that unemployment, although a better figure at about 24%, is still a very high figure and has created a lot of social discontent and is what many people call a ticking time bomb.
It is, particularly given that those that are unemployed are young, some of them are educated, but more importantly, they've got high expectations, because these are the children, some of whom were born in 1994. So when we tell them about where we come from as parents, they expect a lot to be done. And therefore, the expectation gap has to be filled. And I'm very happy that he's focusing on jobs. But the challenge for us is going to be whether in an environment whereby the private sector is not being engaged quite decisively, because government alone can't create jobs. He needs a government as he needs private sector as partners, so that those 5 million jobs that is promised tonight can be created by 2020.
But in his defense, the president and the ANC have consistently called for some sort of partnership between business and government, and lots of emphasis on public-private partnerships just by way of addressing this huge jobs deficit in the country.
Well, the biggest job creator we've seen in the past 4 years was construction. In the past few days, we've seen what has happened to the main players in the construction sector. Firstly, government changed specs. Secondly, government has not paid these corporates. Therefore, it leads these corporates who are world-class corporates. We've seen the work, some of them that they've done in Dubai, Qatar, etc., in terms of really world-class construction services by some companies. Therefore, if our government is not paying and is pussyfooting in terms of delivering to them, we are going to lose those capabilities. In the process, a partner that's so pivotal, because construction absorbs a lot of this so-called semi-skilled and unskilled people into the economy. He has to do more. We have to see government paying some of these companies, so that that bridge, that partnership between private sector and government can be a harmonious one for a common purpose of creating jobs for South Africans.
Andrew, let's bring you into the conversation right now. The government may preach partnership, but it doesn't act in goodwill. And in that context, it's going to be very difficult to get some sort of a consensus or working together between government and business in terms of job creation.
I think it might be a bit harsh to say that they don't act in goodwill. I think, one of the things that you have to acknowledge is we've just come through probably the worst financial crisis that the world has seen since the 1930s. It hasn't been an easy environment to deliver jobs in. When you go through an election campaign, certain promises are made, and then lo and behold, we go through this financial crisis. So I think, in the defense of government, you have to take that into consideration. I don't think it's that government doesn't want to engage business on this. It's just that it hasn't been successful in the past.
What is it that business is looking for?
I think they're looking for consistency in terms of policy. I think they're looking for basically government to become the facilitator of conditions that allow business to flourish. For government not to necessarily be the creator of jobs, but the facilitator of an environment in which jobs can grow.
We keep on hearing this. Government should just create an enabling environment. Business will create the jobs. Post-recession, business is not creating the jobs. South Africa has over 4 million people currently unemployed.
Well, we saw the chasm between government and business in the past few days, playing itself in Cape Town in the Manning Harbour. And you can see that there's a gap. And that gap requires leadership, particularly from government, in terms of really making sure that enabling environment is created. Because without that, we are in a commodity boom. We've seen that oil price above $100 per barrel. And we've seen whether it's iron ore, it's coal prices, they've all firmed up. So we need really that leadership that will indicate the seriousness of government and the process. Business as well, show some leadership in terms of working together with government in partnership for a common agenda as South Africans to have prosperity for all.
Lots of talk right now about the new growth path, and some are saying that is fundamentally South Africa's new macroeconomic policy. Business has raised a lot of reservations, saying it's interventionist on the part of the state, and that job creation, economic growth, all the fundamentals are going to be dictated to by the state.
Well, importantly, I think from a government perspective, they've seen the jobs that institutions like ours, like the Industrial Development Corporation, can play in that. As well as the SOEs, because we're pivotal in terms of providing infrastructure, if you're talking about ESCOM and Transnet, but us as IDC, providing necessary funding, making sure that businesses does have access to funding. So we've been thrown a gauntlet, and we have to pick it up as institutions of government and make sure that we support government in terms of achieving its goal by 2020.
The new growth path, Andrew, and your views have raised businesses' concerns, but what government is saying is we need to, in the next 10 years, create 5 million jobs. We need to find the strategic assets in the economy and make sure that they're productive, a focus on manufacturing, a focus on agriculture, but ultimately the priority, which is to really deal with this unemployment.
Yeah, but I think the new growth path, there've been iterations of it before. The theory behind it is absolutely sound in terms of what needs to be done. I think the question is there maybe isn't enough clarity on the how as opposed to the what. And I think that's where businesses maybe, I wouldn't say up in arms, but are a little bit concerned because they don't necessarily understand it. I think it's a policy that obviously needs to be explained. I think there's a lot of dialogue that will happen before it's enforced, if you can call it that. But as I say, it's the how, not the what's, that needs to be answered.
I know for a fact that Lumkile Mondi knows what is entailed in the new growth path and can explain it to us a little bit better. Pushing for 7% growth, pushing for 5 million jobs in 10 years' time, identifying the strategic areas of government intervention.
Well, the biggest challenge, firstly, at the moment, particularly from our business partners, because we invest in private sector as the IDC, is around infrastructure constraints. Because at the moment, at the present capacity, we are a 4% economy. Being a 4% economy, there's a potential for growth. Being that economy, you are unlikely to dent that unemployment. Right. Therefore, it requires a speedily facilitation of the environment by trusting private sector, by making sure that in the energy side, the refit program of inviting independent power producers is done as speedily as possible. Secondly, the mining law is made much more clearer, because that's an area where I believe that as South Africans, we've got, for example, in the Northern Cape, the best quality and the biggest reserve of manganese that we could be exploiting, creating jobs and beneficiating. So it's a lot of these things that for us to succeed, we need government to come to the party, and government trusting not only the private sector, but the broader society as partners towards the achievement of these goals.
I mean, Andrew, one of the sticking points in this new proposed policy is the so-called consensus on wages and prices, where government is saying, and something that was just said in Kenya right now, high-end workers must accept salary caps so that some of those bonuses, some of those additional bits of cash can be pumped into more interesting ways of creating jobs by industry. We can't be paying executive bonuses millions of rands and still be sitting with people on the breadline.
Sure, I think it's an argument that goes a lot deeper than that. I think, as Lumkile quite correctly said, when you take construction as an example, is you also need to be very careful, because whilst theoretically that sounds great, if you were to artificially lower wage rates, as you'll lose a lot of quality skill that you need. And I think that's been one of the problems that we've historically had. Whilst you can understand the public coming from a point of view and saying that there are certain state institutions, present company excluded, that have not performed and have seen these bonuses going through, as you understand the frustration around it. But to apply a shotgun approach where you suddenly say that the skills that you so desperately need must be almost undervalued in a global context, is, I think it's pretty obvious what will happen to those skills.
So then how else can government raise money? Because in the interim it seems to be that it's the government that must take the lead by way of job creation.
Well, government's got a lot of cash. We've seen the receipts from companies, from private sector, and how, in fact, the position of household has improved, particularly those that are employed, because wages have gone high, they're above inflation, with the public sector having paid more with the settlement that we saw. So the story is very good from public sector perspective. The question and the challenge for public sector is how can they use that back efficiently for South Africans? And that's where I think if they can be smart enough, they can leverage private sector, use less of that money for the economy and use it more for the other areas where there's deficiencies, particularly in terms of the education that was discussed here, the health sector, which stings particularly for the poor because they've got no access to it. So it's all these things that I think government can do more, but they must do less of wanting to be intervention in the economy. Create the incentive, create the support. Let's create well players and well beaters, because we've done it before. The support is there. There are lots of other companies that are medium-sized that can be well beaters so that they can carry the flag and spread the message that we can succeed as a nation.
A bugbear in South Africa is youth unemployment, and I know that President Jacob Zuma is particularly passionate about this issue. He's constantly raised it in his addresses, even in this third one. And there's talk now of a wage subsidy of some sort so that it incentivizes businesses to hire younger workers, lower skilled workers at entry level. Would it work?
It's going to work, Lerato. It's going to work because I think it's one of the ways whereby the private sector will play ball. It will play ball if government also gives in to some of the enabling environment on the NHE, on the transport side. So therefore, I think it will be a challenge for us with our partners as IDC, because that our partners also support government's initiatives. So I think it's going to work. We saw it in 2001. I mean, this is an old idea. The former minister, Trevor Manuel, had it in 2001, but he didn't have support. So hopefully, President Zuma has got support. We can roll it, we'll take it to business, and we can roll it and see at least whether it can work so that we can fail, having tried something.
Right. Andrew, your views on this one? I mean, we know that the Minister of Finance is desperately trying to rein in the deficit and sees it at something like just over 4% of GDP this year. But if we're already talking about things like a wage subsidy, government's got to raise that money somewhere.
Sure.
Do they go to the bond market to raise the money? Do they tax us more? How do they raise the capital?
Well, I suppose that's the question, is you've got a very limited tax base, which is already quite heavily taxed. You've got new things like road tolls coming in. So I think they'll be hard pressed to raise that directly from the taxpayer. But in saying that, the economic and long-term benefits of actually dealing with this problem, I think would far outweigh the initial costs of so doing.
I mentioned the unemployment figure at 24%, Lumkile Mondi, which means a slight improvement of 1.3 percentage points since last year. So about 157,000 jobs that have been created. We need 500,000 jobs created per annum. That can only happen with a growth rate somewhere in the region of 6 to 7%. We've spoken about that. But the areas where we're seeing these jobs being created, it seems to be community and social services, some in the manufacturing circle, but not within the areas which we see as the bedrock of the economy, not in financial services, not in agriculture, not in the mining economy?
Well, we're seeing, in agriculture, we're seeing quite a lot of potential in agriculture. I'm talking specifically about areas that we know that are water endowed and arable, because South Africa is very interesting given our drought potential that we see every 3 or 5 years. So there are areas where we believe that agriculture can work very well. We can improve yields in the eastern part of the country. So therefore, there's an opportunity there. But also in the mining sector, despite these weaknesses, these challenges that you're talking about, there is still lots of opportunities, because I think as long as government can take the threat of nationalization away, despite the challenges that are happening between us and Kumba, if they take away just that nationalization threat, I think that will make sure that the ones that are already there in the system can continue producing, they can start employing. Wow. So there's space on existing one, but there's also a huge opportunity on what we call the green economy, particularly around the solar sector, because one of the areas where we want to do to try and really diversify our source of power and be a progressive nation is to invest on solar, and I see a lot of jobs being created there going forward.
And a final comment, Andrew, this whole question of quality jobs versus just temporary jobs to just fill this big gap?
Sure. Unfortunately, I don't think it can be just one or the other. You obviously want to work towards quality, but there has to be a sort of interim phase. There has to be a program in place, be it subsidies to get the people into the job market, because it sort of grows on its own momentum once you at least get people employed. You can't afford to have 24 and north unemployment. It's just not possible.